All right, so we've got sequence, path, and initiation, right? And remember, these are not different movements, right? These are all different ways to describe the same movement. You know, it's kind of like, I don't know what a good metaphor is, but maybe, you know, I think of, you know, when they're putting up a building, they build that fence around it to keep everybody safe, and then they leave these little holes that you can look through for people who don't have anywhere to go during the day and they just want a building going up, want to watch a building going up. But, you know, depending on which porthole you're looking through, you're going to see a really different aspect of what's going on with the building. So some you might see people working, some you might see the hole in the ground, some you might see the structure building up, some you might see the structure, not just the internal infrastructure, but you might see the outside of the building already completed. You're going to see different aspects from whichever porthole, whichever perspective you take. So these are different aspects of the same phenomenon. Not only that, they're different aspects, but they're not unrelated aspects. They're related. You can't change one without the other. And for right now, I'm separating them out, somewhat artificially, you could say, so that you can understand how each one is different. But you know, it's like, if you change the path of a movement, right? So if I'm, instead of reaching forward, if I reach forward and up, then I've actually changed the sequence. I changed what happened in the joints. Right? If I change any one of these aspects, the other two aspects are going to change. So though I'm saying these are separate aspects and different perspectives, they are interrelated. And it's really important to see the relationship between them. And you know, it's also important to, the other way you can think about them is that they're just different ways of describing the same phenomena, the same movement. Okay? I'm going to add to the list in a moment, but I want to say something about these criteria, because, or these categories. Because right now we're talking about the categories as ways of observing people move. Right? So you could say kind of a third-person description, how you talk about someone else. These categories count for two other ways. There's three ways we can use the categories. So another way we can use these categories is to describe our own experience. So in other words, they could be first-person language, right? So that someone can talk about their experience in terms of initiation, path, or sequence. One of my best friends, who's a dancer, and who is a very spatially oriented mover, right? So he's one of these people who feels space as having different pulls in directions. Space is alive, and you know, he can be pushed and pulled in space. He's suspended in this space that moves in all these different directions, and movement goes outside of him. Now, watching this person dance is really beautiful because it's very much like watching almost somebody swimming. It has that very fluid quality to it, right? So he went for an Alexander lesson, right? Alexander teacher does what an Alexander teacher does. Put her hands on his, around his jaw and the back of his head, right? And I don't know if you've had an Alexander lesson, but Alexander teachers put the hands there. And what they do is they give you this feeling of what it's like to be longer, right? But really what they do, they don't do anything to the person they're touching. They're actually in themselves looking for their own length. And as they find length, they communicate that through their hands to the student. That's the methodology, more or less, right? But so what happens is you get this feeling of like being a little bit longer. Well, every time she put his hands on him, you know, he'd be sitting there, and the idea is you're supposed to feel yourself get longer. He would just stand up, right? Because he felt the direction going into space, and he followed it. And she would get really annoyed because she wanted him to feel the sequence, the transmission of force through his skeleton. So you can see that the same signal is being interpreted, you know. And you know, if I was going to be a neurophysiologist about it, or a really different way, because someone just takes it to mean something different. So these are different ways in which we experience ourselves in movement. So you could say they're different aspects of kinesthesia. For a phenomenologist or an NLP practitioner, I would say these are also different kinesthetic submodalities. Within the modality, the experiential modality of kinesthesia, these are different ways that I can experience myself in motion. Okay? So that's the second aspect. And this is partly what I'm asking you. When I'm asking you, I'm reminding you of your assignment here, to notice for yourself and to begin to notice with each other, which aspect of movement do you notice first? Because I think we all have prejudices or biases that are pre-existing. So I don't know how you're doing with that. Have you figured that out? We don't have all 7 categories yet. So as we keep going, I think it'll be easier for you to figure that out. The third way in which you can use these categories is as pedagogical devices, right? As ways of, let's see, how would I put this? Constructively interfering with someone else's movement. That's called teaching, right? So in other words, there are ways in which, like if you look, and I'll remind you about this later, and it's in the homework. If you look, or really I should say listen to lessons, you will find, that there are some lessons where Moshe or whoever is talking about the bones and how they're moving and what part of the body is being moved. There are some lessons in which, like one of the things we do in lessons is you do the same movement, but you change the initiation. Right? And in almost every lesson, the direction words, I always think of a second grade school teacher, use the direction words. The direction words, words about path, about directions in space, are really important. Move your arm forward, look to the right. We have all these things about space reference versus self-reference. But, directions, well, actually they're constraints, but they're part of the lesson, and they're really important to our methodology, right? So all of these things describe ways that we can look at someone else move, ways that we can describe our own movement, and ways that we have of giving directions or instructions. Okay? So that even though we're talking about this right now in terms of FI and doing an FI evaluation, it becomes really important as, for instance, when you listen to somebody in your initial interview and you hear how they're talking about their experience. Somebody who's talking about, dancers, for instance, are very keyed into initiation, right? So if somebody says, turn to your right, it makes a big difference if I turn to my right from my pelvis, from my shoulder, from my ear, from my heel, right? All of those are different turns. I'm still turning to the right, which changes where the movement's coming from. So some people are really clued into that. Other people are very, like I told you about my friend here, are really clued into path, right? So the more you understand how the student is describing their own experience, the better you can start to talk to them about what you observe or what you would like them to do or what you want them to become aware of in the aspect of the movement that they're already aware of. If you talk to somebody who's very spatially oriented, like the Alexander teacher did, only about sequence, and you don't recognize that they're reinterpreting everything in terms of path, there's going to be a disconnect there. Okay? So I'm just giving you some hints about how this model is useful beyond what we're using it for at the moment. All right, so let's go to the next category. Okay? And that will be